Sally, thank you very much for doing this. You're the second of my colleagues I've interviewed. The first was Roger White about the fine-tuning argument. So who are you? Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Sally Haslanger. I'm a professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT on the philosophy side. And I work in social political philosophy. I am affiliated with the Women's and Gender Studies program at MIT and also affiliated now with D-Lab.
And you've also done important work in metaphysics, among other things.
That has, yes. I have done important work in metaphysics, epistemology, a little bit of work in philosophy of language. I've also published on Aristotle, and I sometimes teach the history of philosophy.
All right. So we've been reading your famous paper in the Norton Anthology, Gender and Race, which has generated a substantial sort of literature of its own.
So true.
For good or ill. And I'll get on to how your view has evolved in a moment. But in the lectures, we've been concentrating on passages like these. Although the analyses I offer will point to existing social kinds, and this is no accident, I'm not prepared to defend the claim that these social kinds are what our race and gender talk is really about. My priority in this inquiry is not to capture what we do mean, but how we might usefully revise what we mean for certain theoretical and political purposes. Okay, so I have a question about that. So your suggested revision for the word woman, just focusing on the emphasis on revision for the moment, your suggested revision for the word woman is roughly, someone is a woman just in case she's subordinated because she's presumed to have female reproductive features, and as you say in the paper, females who aren't women in the sense defined, perhaps Queen Elizabeth II, are not counterexamples to the analysis because it's a revisionary proposal, at least in the paper. And so given this revisionary proposal, you could describe the project of feminism as you say, to bring about a day when there are no more women, just like the abolitionist about slavery might say, we want to bring about a day when there are no more slaves. Okay, so could you say something about why this proposed revision might be useful? Could I give you my little pig analogy if it would help?
No, I got the pig analogy.
Okay.
Let me sort of contextualize the paper a little bit.
Right.
So I saw myself in the paper as giving a real definition, which means I was trying to find a kind that was of special importance to feminists. And why was I interested in this kind? Well, prior to, well, in the early 90s, let's say, there was some work that had suggested that it made no sense to use the category of gender. Why not? Well, the category of sex was sort of taken for granted. And when feminists had started using the category of gender, the goal of that was to recognize that the meaning of sex varied culture to culture, sort of historical period to historical period. And so there was this interest in how sex was interpreted and what kind of impact it had on the lives of individual females. And so gendering was a process of becoming, you know, a social female, so to speak, a female who occupied a certain social role. So the task, and in that literature, there was a convention to use the term female for people individuated by their biology, reproductive function, and women to speak of people who were the socially adapted females, so to speak, the females who had taken on a particular social role. So that was conventional in that literature. But then there were some skeptics who said, well, look, there is no such category of women because there is such incredible diversity across history and across culture about how the female body and female reproductive capacities, et cetera, have been interpreted. This is just a heterogeneous, hodgepodge, gerrymandered group of people and group of social positions, and there is no such thing as women. And then there came a moment where people said, well, if there's no such thing as women, then the goal of feminism has been undermined, because feminism
it's about women if it's
about women, right? So feminism's goal is to emancipate women, but if there are no women, then what are we going to do? We have no subject of our efforts. And there actually were T-shirts resisting this. I actually had one that said, I'll be post-feminism, but I'll be a post-feminist in the post-patriarchy, right? Because the idea was there's still this problem of the treatment of women and the disadvantage that falls on women. So I felt that there were some serious mistakes in this discussion about what it would be to say that there are women. And so my paper was an intervention at that moment, at that historical moment. I wrote it in the mid-90s. It was published in 2000, because I wanted to suggest that the people who were saying there are no women, even insofar as they were thinking of that as gender and not sex, were misguided. And so I said, look, there is still the social meaning of sex, the social meaning of sexed bodies. It varies from culture to culture to culture, but just because it varies from culture to culture doesn't mean that we can't find something in common between all of these individuals who have been through this socialization process, namely that they've been through a socialization process that was enforced on them because of the interpretation of their bodies. But some people had said, Judith Butler in particular said, well, any attempt to define what women is always going to marginalize some women. And I said, yeah, sure, that might be. But if you're a feminist and your concern is to have a way to capture that group that feminism is committed to, you could go ahead and say, yeah, it's that group whose lives have been disadvantaged by this socialization process that situate them in a particular category. And if, say, the Queen of England is marginalized in that analysis, that shouldn't be a problem for the feminist, because the feminist, if she's not oppressed, which I think is false, and Mari, I think it's false that she's not oppressed. I think queens and kings get treated differently, et cetera, and she gets treated a certain way because she's a woman. Yeah. But if there are any women who face no deprivations or discrimination because of their bodies, then that we don't have to really get all worked up about that. So what I was trying to do was identify a phenomenon that I think is transhistorical, transcultural, that is a proper subject matter for feminist inquiry and feminist attention. And I was using the term woman as it had been used in the literature up until that point for the social meaning of sex. And then the question is, well, am I talking about women the way we, it's like, well, I'm going to appropriate that term for this purpose the way others have appropriated it. And there were further reasons why I felt like it should be appropriated, but it wasn't part of my project to say, oh, this is what woman ordinarily means in the mouth of the ordinary English speaker. That wasn't the project.
It didn't really matter whether
it didn't really matter
whether it was or not. Okay, but then why not just say, why not just skip the revisionary analysis and just say, well, look, here is some important feature that almost every women have, namely being subordinated because they're presumed to have female reproductive features, and leave it at that, as opposed to
right. So I have been for decades now interested in the project of critical theory. And critical theory, one of the ways in which it's distinguished from other kinds of theories is according to Raymond Goyce, it's supposed to be emancipatory. And what this means seems to be, though it varies author to author, is that in reading the theory, somehow you break through ideology, you break through some way of looking at the world that is problematic. And this, for example, you find in Marx, Marx, encouraging us to rethink the wage labor contract, etc. And I was interested in this idea that theories can do more than just describe reality. They can shift a paradigm is what how I now think of it. And so I thought that if we use a technical term like, Schwoman or whatever for this, yeah, a number of theorists are going to care about it, but it won't really have much of an impact. But if we appropriate the language woman and we get people to think of themselves or think of their situation in these terms, because our gender matters to us, this might kind of cause a paradigm shift or cause some kind of disorientation in relation to their experience of their gender, and would allow them to maybe think about it differently. But I said in the paper that this has to be used with care and caution, right?
Yes.
That it's not something that you can just use anywhere, anytime, that it's a delicate matter. So for example, especially about race, I was saying, like, who am I, this white girl, suggesting that we ought to appropriate the language of race, right? That's not my
That is not a bit
role.
that I should emphasize, that is not a bit that I edited out when I edited this paper. So
Yeah.
the point is not to legislate what terms to use in all contexts, but to offer resources that should be used judiciously.
Yes. So that was the idea, this kind of critical, let's mess with people. Let's try and prompt a paradigm shift so that people who think of themselves, think of their gender as sort of given or natural or unavoidable, might instead start to say, wait a minute, maybe these assumptions I have about myself because I'm a woman or because I'm a man, maybe they're not as given as it might seem. So it was an effort to do that political work together with the theoretical work.
Right. Okay, great. So this naturally leads to my second question, which is about the evolution of your.
Oh, but you wanted to talk about the pig.
No, forget about it.
No. Okay, because the
Don't
pigs don't, I'm not trying to change the paradigm for the pig.
Strike
right?
the
So
pig.
anyway,
Strike the pig. Okay, no one will understand what we're talking about. But anyway.
Okay, all right.
But in later work, you suggested that your analyses might actually capture what we do mean, in which case there's no revisionary project. And as you say, this is a possibility. This is something that I've been stressing in the lectures when we're talking about race and gender. Because we can sometimes be seriously mistaken about whether our words apply to things. We're mistaken about whether whales were fish, to use the standard philosophical example, or to use one of your examples. Someone could be mistaken about whether evergreens have needles and think, yeah, they all do, thus falsely excluding rhododendron from the category evergreen. And I did read an interview with you on Medium the other day where you again stressed that we're ignorant. I think the topic was gender. And we're ignorant about a lot of our words. So what is, and then also in that book on, that very edifying book on race with Quayshaw and Spencer and two others, you strongly suggest, I think there, that, we're uncovering I'm uncovering what we mean all along by giving my socio-political account of race. So anyway, so what is your current considered position? Are we revising what we mean at all, asking us to use an old term in a new way? Or are you instead exposing what we meant all along?
So I don't think I have a decided answer to this question, because I think there are contexts in which I want to say that this is what we were meaning all along. and there are contexts in which I don't want to say that. But let me step back a little bit and sort of maybe give a frame for the shift. So, what in the case of gender, there are very few people who are inclined to say that we ought to be eliminativists about gender the way they say this about race.
Right.
They are inclined to say that there is sex, there is gender, there is reality out there, there's difference in chromosomes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever. In the case of race, there's a strong contingent of people who think that the racial terms lack a referent. There is nothing in the world that we're talking about.
Right.
And in fact, there were quite a few people who were complaining about my view about race that I also articulate in the paper, that I wasn't really talking about what we mean, so I could be excluded from discussions around what race is because I'm just playing with the word. I'm not really investigating what race is.
Yeah.
This was not quite what I had hoped for, because I felt as though, even though I was trying to investigate real kinds in the world, real social kinds in the world, those real social kinds were connected to our everyday speech. Okay, in the case of race, it was easier to make this case because clearly when people say things like Colin Powell is Black and Obama is Black and Martin Luther King is Black and such like that, it would be weird to say, oh no, that's wrong. They're not really Black, right? But that's what the eliminativists would have us say, that all of that language is false, or that I'm white or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I was inclined to say, wait a minute, right? You people who are assuming that you had to have a biological basis for race in order to have race, mean what we mean, are confused about how language works, because the way they would usually argue for this is go, what's my intuition? My intuition about race is that it's a biological category, so it must necessarily be a biological category. And so I was inclined to say, no, there's this different way to look at meaning. What you do is you take up some paradigm cases like Martin Luther King, and then some paradigm white person like George Washington, and you say, these are our paradigm cases. And then you try to do empirical investigation and consider, okay, so what is this kind that includes, Frederick Douglass and Obama and whatever. And what I was arguing in that case is, look, they do have something in common. They have something social in common.
Right.
And just because they don't have something biological in common doesn't mean that that's not what we mean by race. Okay, so on the race side, I felt there was a pretty strong argument to suggest that we had paradigm cases, that it would be wrong to say we were speaking falsely about those cases, that we could do an investigation into what all the cases had in common and come up with something. So I wanted to go that way, but you see, I have this parallel going, right, with race and gender. So then I said, okay, let's do that the same on the other side as well. Well, it doesn't work as well on the gender side as it does on the race side, because there really aren't the kind of eliminativists that were available on the race side. So I did go ahead though and say, well, what is it that, and then I started to notice, well, it wasn't like I started to notice, but I tried to highlight that there are people we would call women who don't have the right kind of reproductive tools, genitalia, things like this. So trans women. There were people, and we still might say they're women. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir herself would talk about how, well, we say that certain people aren't real women, but they have the same plumbing as other, women. So why aren't they real women? So it started to seem to me as though if we were talking about gender and not about sex, we could start to go this way. If woman was a gender term, then maybe it wouldn't have to, you know, track the biological, and maybe we could find that there were these assumptions in our attributions of gender to people that would support the same sort of claim that I had made for race. Is that too complicated?
Yeah, no, right.
And so I felt like I was sort of, you know, in a way, because I was trying to theorize the two together in a way, and I see that there are structural similarities, I think I was being pushed back and forth by my insights in one influencing my thinking about the other, and vice versa. That's kind of how it went.
Okay, so that's a good lead in to the next question. So as you said in the paper, you make a lot of the parallels between, the striking parallels, you call them, between race and gender, but you might think there are at least some important differences. I mean, this often comes up in popular discussions of these things. In particular, people seem to be much more comfortable with the idea of changing gender than they are with the idea of changing race. So what do you think about these sorts of apparent differences?
Well, I'm not going to be able to give a thorough going analysis of why they're treated differently.
Yeah.
But I do think that gender identity and racial identity are very different. So, as you know, my husband and I have adopted 2 African-American children. And at the time, in the mid-90s, there was a lot of controversy about this. And people in the Black community, some people in the Black community felt that this was wrong because Black children couldn't really develop a secure racial identity being brought up by white parents. But around the mid-90s, people started to notice that unless one had a secure identity as a person, as a human, as an individual, one was going to be to struggle in life in a very serious way. And this kind of failure to develop a secure identity tended to happen with children who'd grown up in foster care, many foster homes, people who'd grown up in group homes, and that racial identity didn't develop until relatively late in the process of socialization. And it was influenced quite a lot by one's community, one's peers, one's family, all of these sorts of things. And so you could have a secure racial identity even though you were living, with white parents, a non-white racial identity. It's in the case of gender, it seems to be quite different. There is this phenomenon of a body schema that even very young children have, that is an understanding of their bodies as, it seems, as male or female. And there's no such thing as a kind of primitive racial schema that people have when they're very young like this. And so one of the important differences between race and gender is that I think in some cases at least, people from a quite young age have a body schema, a cognitive, emotional schema that doesn't fit their actual bodies. And so what one group of trans folk that I think people are trying to respect and understand when they're accepting trans women as women is those whose experience themselves and live in their bodies as women who don't have the relevant genitalia. There isn't the same sort of thing going on in the case of race, right? That's not a group of people, for example, who we really are, importantly trying to accommodate their deepest lived experience, because racial identity develops quite late and develops in community and develops in response to how your particular social milieu organizes racial difference and ethnic difference. So I think that's one reason, one tiny reason, but one reason why these are such different sort of movements. The movements to embrace transgender people as as the gender they identify with, but not necessarily embrace supposed transracial people in the categories they identify.
Okay, great. So I mean, this actually came up when I was talking with Anthony Appiah. Of course, there's the famous example which you discuss, I think, because it might be raised by Quayshaw and Spencer in that volume on race of Rachel Dolezal. And your account of race would treat Dolezal, at any rate before we discovered that she had white parents, as black. So the account seems sort of tailor-made to accommodate Rachel Dolezal's identification as black. I'm not saying this is not supposed to be an objection. I'm just
right. But I do think it's a tricky case because, you know, as she grew up, she was not racialized as black. She grew up in a family of white folks and lived as a white. In fact, she filed a lawsuit against Howard University.
I mean, she didn't go to Howard University.
I know, but she filed a lawsuit against them because she felt that she was discriminated against because she was white, right? So she did go to Howard, but she went to Howard with an identity as a white person, right? So she was claiming discrimination against her as a white person. So her own personal history is quite complicated here. And I feel as though she's not a good example.
No, right. We should consider a more fictionalized case.
No, but there's Gregory Williams is a really fascinating example for my account, because he's someone who had a black father and a white mother, but looking at him, you would never guess he had a black father, right? He looks like my brother, right? Say. Well, his mother left. He went to live with his father's family, with his brother, and he was always told that his father was just Mediterranean, something like this. And anyway, he then was integrated into the Black community, and they accepted him as black because he had more than one drop of black blood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, he's a fascinating case. Was he black or was he not black? I mean, my view is sort of, you know, it would have to be sort of temporally sensitive. It would have to be contextually sensitive in ways that I haven't really given much detail. But notice in my analysis of race, I don't argue. In the analysis of gender, I say what it is for an individual to be a member of a gender. In the case of race, I don't do that. I say what it is for a group to be a racial group, and I don't give conditions on membership in the racial group. And so my feeling about race is going to be, look, in the Greg Williams case, you know, he was accepted in, right, to the group, and then the group had this feature of being treated differently, where Dolezal was not included in the group. And so there's going to be some room there where, because I intentionally did it that way, because I felt
you do have, we can say that S's of the white, black, Asian race, if and only if those groups are racialized groups, and S is a member of the group.
And they're a member of the group, but I don't say what the conditions for membership are.
I see. Okay, good.
That's left to like Native Americans, right? Yeah. So there's going to be Native American group membership, which is very different from Black group membership, which is very different from Asian group membership. These are very contested and differentiated criteria for group membership. And so I didn't want to specify what the conditions of group membership are.
Right. Okay, excellent. All right, so last question, and then I should let you go. So actually, I just asked Louise Anthony a version of this question. So I'm interested to compare and contrast. So
is Louise going to, you interviewed Louise also for the
second time I interviewed Louise. I interviewed her first when we read her paper on the problem of evil. And then I thought I'd have her back for the race and gender. Okay. So you are an activist as well as being some fancy ivory tower philosopher concerned with abstract metaphysical questions. And if you're concerned with the welfare of women globally, then you might well think that all this fancy philosophical theorizing about gender is just, well, it might be of academic interest, but it's of academic interest only. It's not going to improve women's lives, improve the female literacy rate, or end forced marriage or domestic violence or anything like that. So what is your view on the connection or lack thereof between the ivory tower and activism on the ground?
Well, I can say what mine is. So I think that it is important for members of subordinated groups where their subordination has been naturalized, thought to be normal, etc., that we find ways to destabilize those assumptions. And this historically has required some, research, being able to say things like, the fact that you behave this way is not determined genetically, it's not determined by having these chromosomes or having these hormones or something. And then trying to say, well, then why is it the case that there are these patterns that seem to appear that differentiate men and women, say, or members of different races? If it's not natural, if it's not determined physically, why do we see these regularities? And so I think that part of what feminist theorists can do, metaphysicians like me, for example, can do, is give alternative explanations of the regularities so that we can combat the objections. Oh no, this is just how women are. And I think that those kinds of arguments are good, not just for arguing with elites like lawyers and legislators and people like that so they can pass laws that make sex discrimination illegal, but also, as I was mentioning earlier on, in a kind of paradigm shifting for individuals who are subordinated. Part of what you need to do is say, look, you don't have to identify with all those things that people have told you defined who you were. There are alternatives here. If you understand the sources of those assumptions about what it is to be a woman, then maybe you can distance yourself from them and be freed from some of the norms and some of the pressures and such like that. So the purely metaphysical part, I think, is just trying to figure out for myself even, okay, so how do we explain these patterns? How do we explain the durability of the subordination of women? Really, that has happened. It's been a long time that women have subordinated. How, if it's not natural, so to speak, that women are inferior, submissive, blah, 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 how has it persisted for so long? That's a matter of tremendous curiosity for me, but I think it's also something that we need to get into public awareness and public consciousness, that there are these alternative explanations of why this inferiority has persisted. We need to have alternative explanations of racial hierarchy than just, oh yes, well, Black people can't keep a job, or they can't, or they're criminal or whatever like this. I mean, those are false, but to have a better understanding about what the right explanation is, I think, is extremely important for activism. And then in the case of actually things like literacy rate and such like this, as you know, I teach a class now in D-Lab at MIT, which on gender and development, which works to improve the conditions of women in very vulnerable communities. And so the project I'm most involved with is in Kenya. And what we do is we provide the students a lot of theory that they can draw on as they go into working directly with the Kenyan women to think about, well, what is women's agency, and how do we understand these differences between our assumptions about what it is to be a woman and their assumptions about what it is to be a woman? How do we think about the different ways of managing female biological functions like menstruation and pregnancy and childbirth and lactation. And this is about gender, remember. It's not just about sex. Yes, we go through these things with our bodies, but all of what we go through in our bodies is mediated by what the culture teaches us about those things, what practices people are engaged in when they are dealing with menstruation or pregnancy or childbirth and things like this. And so to understand the gendering of these practices and the gendering of the societies as you're going in and trying to work with the women to give them resources and to make their lives better, the theory is really important. Really, really
okay,
important.
yeah, great. So that's one direct route where theory can influence practice. Your class at MIT, of course, you're not reaching that many people in this class. But what about the transmitting your understanding of gender and race to a wider public? How is that to be accomplished exactly? I mean,
well, you see, I see myself as part of a broad movement. I am not the movement. I am just part of a movement. And the movement comes across all kinds of questions along the way. So Catherine Jenkins in her paper, for example, where she discusses my work, says she was involved in a Take Back the Night March organizing, and they were trying to figure out who should be allowed to march in the Take Back the Night March, because typically men are not allowed. And so they had this long discussion about, well, who's going to count as a woman for the purposes of the march? And so I wasn't there, right? I didn't have any input, but the fact that I could provide a frame for thinking about how we might understand who women are or what it is to be a woman, that was used in the context of the march. So I think that as part of a movement, we're trying to answer all kinds of questions about who counts as a woman, whose needs matter, what sort of needs matter, who decides that, etc. And I think the theorist is trying to contribute to that through writing, but also through going to meetings and being on the ground and making signs to hold at rallies, like this. Posting on Instagram.
right. Okay, terrific. Sally, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.